No one saw it coming, not the crowd, not the press, not even the royals themselves. At a global Commonwealth summit in 2003, the world paused when a foreign prime minister stepped up to the podium and named Prince Harry the People's Royal Emissary, a title once linked only to Princess Diana. The room fell silent, and then King Charles broke down in tears. Sitting beside Camilla, he lowered his head, whispered, "She would have loved this," and wiped his eyes in full view of the cameras. For the first time since her funeral, Diana's name wasn't just remembered, it was passed down to the son who walked away from the crown, but never walked away from her. And in that single moment, the monarchy changed, not by law, but by love, the announcement that no one saw coming. In early 2026, the world turned its eyes to New Zealand, where a major Commonwealth summit was underway. The event brought together heads of state, cultural figures, and representatives from across former British territories. It was supposed to be diplomatic, predictable, ceremonial, no controversy, no surprises. But everything changed at the closing ceremony. As the final speaker took the stage, the New Zealand Prime Minister, known for being poised and understated, delivered a statement that dropped like lightning through the crowd. "Tonight, we honor Prince Harry as the People's Royal Emissary, a spirit once carried by his mother, now reborn in her son." Gasps, applause, silence. A ripple moved through the hall like a quiet shockwave. This was no formal royal title. It wasn't endorsed by the palace. But it carried something far heavier: public meaning, emotional truth, and the unmistakable shadow of Princess Diana. Seated just one row from the stage, King Charles was visibly shaken. He had attended the summit out of duty, expecting gentle praise and polished speeches. What he didn't expect was to hear Diana's legacy not just invoked, but passed on. According to one official sitting near him, Charles lowered his head, clutched a white handkerchief, and whispered, "She would have loved this." Next to him, Camilla remained stiff, eyes scanning the room. But Charles looked cracked open, a monarch silenced by memory. What made the moment even more powerful was that Harry wasn't a scheduled speaker. He hadn't asked for this tribute. He had flown in at the last minute with Meghan and their children, planning only to attend, not to receive. The honor was a surprise, even to him. It wasn't about rank, it was about heart. And in that moment, the Commonwealth, a community Diana once walked through barefoot and smiling, made its choice clear. They hadn't forgotten her, and they hadn't forgotten the one who still walked like her. As applause filled the room, the echoes of Diana's legacy grew louder than any official royal announcement. But what truly stunned people wasn't just the title, it was who gave it and why. Because behind that carefully chosen phrase, the People's Emissary, was a decision made quietly by nations who once bowed to the crown, now rising to speak for the people. The title that echoes Diana's legacy. The phrase, the People's Emissary, hadn't been spoken publicly since 1997, the year Diana died. Though the world gave her the title People's Princess, royal protocol never acknowledged it. And after her death, the monarchy did something even colder. It made sure no one else ever received it. Until now. In the months leading up to the Commonwealth Summit, leaders from 4 former colonies, Canada, Barbados, Jamaica, and South Africa, began quietly drafting a joint tribute. They had observed Harry's continued work in mental health, climate activism, and veterans' causes, all done without palace support. No formal title, no press machine, just effort, quiet, consistent, heartfelt. "He showed up when no one asked him to," said a Jamaican delegate. "He hugged people who didn't have shoes. He listened more than he talked. He reminded us of her." Another diplomat added, "This wasn't about blood. It was about soul, and Harry's was unmistakably Diana's." So they proposed the title, People's Emissary, an informal but symbolic honor given by the people, not the palace. One that didn't require crowns or consent from royal protocol, just recognition. By the time Harry arrived at the summit, the plans were already set, and when the Prime Minister spoke those words, it became official, not in a legal sense, but in the hearts of millions watching. The world remembered a woman who had walked through hospitals with no gloves, who hugged children that others avoided. And now, they saw her reflection, not in a throne, but in a sun. Signs appeared in the crowd. He's his mother's son. She lives through him. The people's prince. The crown had moved on, but the people hadn't. And with one sentence, Diana's legacy wasn't just remembered. It was passed down. But while the world celebrated, not everyone in the room was cheering. Cameras quietly turned from Harry to a man who hadn't expected to feel the weight of the past so suddenly. Sitting front and center, King Charles was no longer watching a royal summit. He was watching a moment he couldn't control, and emotions he couldn't contain. King Charles's emotional collapse. King Charles had seen decades of history unfold in public. The protests, the divorces, the pageantry, the pain. But he had always kept his composure. Through everything, he stayed measured, distant. Even when the public mourned Diana, he stood stoic at her funeral, barely blinking. But that night in New Zealand, something shifted. As the words "People's Emissary" rang out and the audience erupted in applause, Charles leaned forward. His hands trembled. He wiped his eyes, once, then again. He wasn't crying for the cameras. He was crying because the past had caught up with him in a room full of strangers. According to a staff member seated nearby, Charles whispered, "She would have loved this. She would have loved him for this." It wasn't a political reaction. It was personal. He wasn't a king in that moment. He was a widower, a father, a man haunted by memory. Camilla, seated beside him, reached out gently, her hand resting on his back. But Charles didn't move. He reportedly whispered something else. "I should have given him more." No one knows if he meant Harry, Diana, or both. But everyone in the room heard the regret. The public had rarely seen Charles like this. Even his coronation had been measured, ceremonial. This was vulnerability, a crack in the royal mask. And once it broke, it revealed something raw beneath the crown. Grief that had never fully healed. This moment marked the first time Charles had publicly broken down in relation to Diana since her death. For decades, his silence was seen as indifference. But here, under soft lighting and amid thousands of strangers, the dam finally burst. A photographer captured it. The image of a teary-eyed Charles went viral by morning. One journalist wrote, "In a world of duty, this was the first time he looked human." But even as Charles wrestled with emotion, the spotlight shifted to the one who had inherited her fire. Prince Harry walked toward the stage, not as a royal, not as a rebel, but as a son. And when he stepped behind the podium, his voice didn't carry the sound of royalty. It carried the sound of Diana's truth. Harry's speech that melted royal divides. When Prince Harry stepped up to the podium, the room was still ringing with emotion. Meghan stood nearby, holding little Lilibet, with Archie beside her, clapping softly like the other children in the audience. It wasn't a royal moment. It was a human one, and everyone in the room could feel it. Harry took a long pause before speaking. He looked out at the crowd, then down at the medal he'd been handed. His voice cracked slightly, but he didn't hide it. He wasn't reading a speech from paper. He was speaking from the heart. "I never asked to replace anyone," he began. "I only ever wanted to continue what she started." The room fell silent. He didn't have to say her name. Everyone knew he meant Diana. And in that moment, he wasn't just a prince. He was a son standing in his mother's echo. He continued, carefully avoiding direct references to royal family rifts, but weaving in lines filled with grace, pain, and pride. This title isn't about power or politics. It's about presence, about showing up when the world forgets you. My mother did that. I've tried to do the same. People wiped away tears. Others stood quietly, hands over hearts. For the first time in a long time, Harry wasn't being judged by headlines or royal drama. He was simply being heard. As he neared the end of his speech, he looked at his children and said, "She walked so we could stand, and now I'll walk for her." The applause was thunderous. It wasn't the kind reserved for officials. It was the kind that comes from people who feel seen. In that moment, Harry didn't just receive a symbolic title. He reclaimed something the crown never gave him: his voice. While the crowd rose to their feet and cameras flashed, the one person missing from the moment wasn't forgotten. Prince William, though not present in the room, was very much a part of the emotional fallout. And behind closed doors, he was grappling with something few expected: relief, pride, and fear. William's private response: Prince William didn't attend the summit. Officially, he had prior engagements in London. Unofficially, insiders say he chose not to go, to avoid attention, and to let Harry have the moment without the pressure of their complicated relationship overshadowing it. But William was watching. A palace source confirmed he viewed the speech from a private room at Kensington Palace, flanked by Catherine and his senior aide. When the camera zoomed in on Harry holding back tears, William reportedly muttered, "It was always meant for him." After the ceremony, William released a short public statement. It congratulated Harry and acknowledged the emotional significance of the moment, saying, "Our mother's legacy continues in many forms. This is one of them. I'm proud of him." It was brief but respectful, and for the first time in years, not filtered through tension. Privately, however, things were more layered. One aide described William's mood as deeply conflicted. He knew Harry had honored Diana in a way that couldn't be denied. But there were concerns, too, about the political undertone, the palace optics, and whether this would further drive a wedge between royal protocols and public sentiment. William reportedly told Catherine in private, "It can't divide us now, not again." And for the first time in months, he picked up the phone and called his brother. The call was short, civil, no deep reconciliation, no dramatic apology, but it was something. And for two brothers who had stood oceans apart, it was a start. The press never confirmed the call officially, but a source close to both camps said they needed this, not as royals, as sons. Because while Diana's legacy lived on through Harry in public, it lived on through both of them, in grief, in memory, and in the hope of healing something they'd both lost. But not everyone viewed the night with warmth. As Harry's image rose and Diana's name echoed louder, one royal figure found herself pushed further into the shadows. And for Camilla, the weight of public rejection began to show. Camilla's discomfort. As Camilla, Queen Consort, watched the summit unfold beside her husband, the cracks began to show, not in the monarchy, but in her place within it. For decades, she had worked hard to step out of Diana's shadow. But with just one sentence, the People's Emissary, that shadow returned. Back at their hotel, Camilla reportedly made a sharp remark to her aides. "So, we're rewriting history now." Her tone, said one staffer, wasn't angry. It was resigned. She knew how the world saw her, and for a brief moment, she realized just how little that image had changed. Social media wasn't kind. Within hours, hashtags like "or the real queen returns," #Diana's son, and #Camilla who were trending. TikToks flooded with side-by-side comparisons of Diana comforting children and Camilla attending ceremonies in silence. One viral post read, "You can't compete with love," and Diana still has all of it. Public opinion polls revealed a dramatic drop in Camilla's favorability, especially among younger generations. Many had grown up hearing whispers of betrayal, and now they were watching the world openly choose Diana's memory over Camilla's role. The comparison wasn't fair, but it was real. Within days, Camilla canceled 2 public appearances, citing emotional exhaustion. The palace remained silent, but the press speculated heavily. Was she overwhelmed? Was it a statement? Was it a quiet retreat? A royal insider commented, "She didn't sign up for this part, to lose a battle to someone who isn't even here." But that's exactly what happened. Because the world didn't just celebrate Harry that night, they resurrected Diana. And they made it clear, she still owned the room. The world reacts. The morning after the summit, headlines exploded across the globe. "Diana lives on through Harry," read one UK paper. "A son's promise fulfilled," said another. In Australia, a primetime news anchor opened her broadcast with, "She was gone, but last night, Diana spoke again. Through her son." The moment had crossed borders. What began as a symbolic honor in New Zealand became a worldwide emotional wave. Social media lit up with hashtags like #Diana's son, #the people still choose her, and #the People's Emissary. But one stood out more than any other. #the real queen returns. Photos of Diana re-emerged in every language. Clips of her walking through minefields, hugging sick children, and smiling with her sons filled Instagram reels, TikTok edits, and YouTube shorts. People weren't just remembering her. They were choosing her all over again. Celebrities, activists, and even former critics of the Sussexes joined in. Oprah Winfrey posted, "Legacy lives where love never left." Sir Elton John, who had been close to Diana, tweeted, "She'd be proud, so proud." But the most surprising shift came from the public, not just in sentiment, but in numbers. A major UK poll conducted days after the summit showed Harry's favorability rating had jumped to its highest level. Since 2018, particularly among those aged 25 to 50. One pollster explained, "This wasn't about forgiveness, it was about recognition. People saw him, and they saw her in him." Even longtime royal correspondents, usually critical of Harry's departure from the firm, softened their tone. One wrote, "They tried to silence Diana, but now her son speaks louder than ever." It wasn't about challenging the monarchy. It wasn't even about reclaiming it. It was about redefining what royalty looks like, not by title, but by heart. And through Harry, the world finally felt like Diana had been heard. But behind all the emotion, one question lingered quietly. What would this moment mean for the royal future? Because although the honor had no formal weight, its emotional magnitude was undeniable. And in the days that followed, even behind palace walls, the crown began to bend, not by rule, but by remembrance. The crown rewritten in emotion, not law. Technically, the People's Emissary title had no official standing. It wasn't issued by the palace, written into law, or part of any royal charter. But in the eyes of the people, it carried more weight than any royal decree. It didn't rewrite the Constitution, but it rewrote the conversation, and the crown felt it. Inside Clarence House, sources say King Charles was deeply moved. Just days after the ceremony, he did something he had quietly resisted for years. He commissioned a new portrait of Diana, not for public display, but for his private residence. According to a palace aide, the request was made softly, without fanfare, and came with only one instruction: let her be smiling. This gesture, though private, sent a clear signal. The crown wasn't denying her anymore. It was finally acknowledging her, and that wasn't the only shift. Quiet talks began behind palace walls about inviting Harry to a future royal remembrance event, not in the background, but in a central role. Nothing was confirmed, and no dates were leaked, but insiders say the idea was being gently explored. One former royal aide explained, "This wasn't about Harry being crowned, it was about Diana being heard, and for the firm that changes everything." The monarchy didn't crumble, but something softer happened. It started to reflect. And that reflection came not from strategy or speeches, but from emotion. This moment proved that the public still decides whose voice matters most. And Diana's voice, even in silence, still echoes louder than titles, tradition, and time itself. As for Harry, he hasn't claimed the title. He hasn't used it in interviews or asked for recognition. When questioned by a reporter in Los Angeles days later, he simply smiled and said, "That moment belonged to her. I was just there to carry it." And that, perhaps, is what made it all so powerful. No agenda, no fight, just love. For a mother who left too soon, and a world that never forgot her. Because in the end, it wasn't about the crown at all. It was about a voice that lived on, in a son brave enough to speak it aloud. Some moments don't need royal approval to matter. They don't come with fanfare or ceremony. They arrive quietly, and they change everything. When Prince Harry was named the People's Royal Emissary, the world didn't just hear a new title. They heard Diana's voice, alive, rising again, through her son. And when King Charles broke down in front of cameras, it wasn't politics. It was grief finally catching up with him. The years he buried, the words he never said. In that room, he wasn't a monarch. He was a man, remembering the woman the world still calls its Queen of Hearts. Harry didn't ask for this honor. He didn't chase it. But when it came, he carried it like Diana would have, with humility, compassion, and strength. He didn't speak of crowns. He spoke of service. He didn't speak of duty. He spoke of love. And that's what made the world listen. Because no matter how many palaces are built, no matter how many titles are handed out, legacy isn't measured in thrones. It's measured in truth. And Diana's truth, after all these years, still echoes louder than any royal decree. Through Harry, it was finally given a second chance. Through Charles's tears, it was finally acknowledged. And through the eyes of the world, it was finally clear. This wasn't about rewriting the monarchy. It was about finishing a story that was left unfinished for far too long. She walked so we could stand. Now, he walks for her, and the world is walking with him.